In 2016, identity politics are meaningless, stupid, and malicious. So much so, in fact, that I see teenagers thinking that identity politics not just are, but always have been stupid. But that is not the case, and it is important that we understand it. Identity politics used to make a lot of sense, and the reason they are meaningless nowadays is actually because they have achieved their goals and served their purpose. So this is a good moment to look back and remind ourselves what they were about and how they changed our world. And through this observation, hopefully, realize why they have now become obsolete and liberate ourselves from the hold that they still have on our minds. Identity politics came about because of the failed promises of modern Western civilization. This civilization is committed to the ideal of creating a society that guarantees equal rights and opportunities for all, but failed to achieve it for certain groups because these groups are perceived as the other of that society. Being the other means not just being different. It means that your identity negates the way that society perceived its own identity. So to maintain that identity, this society must exclude you. When you are the other of a certain society, you have no chance of advancing very far in it, unless you change and adopt an identity that is in line with the prevailing logic. Or, unless you group together with your kind and fight to change the prevailing logic and to create a society that has a more inclusive perception of its identity, one that includes your identity as well. The struggle to achieve this change is what became known as identity politics. That was the general picture. Now let's talk more specifically about the groups that were otherized, why this happened, and how identity politics helped change the situation. It played slightly differently in each Western society, but we will focus on the United States of America, as it is the country that served as the main battlefield of ideas in the 20th century. We are actually talking about the 19th and 20th centuries, a period generally defined as the modern age. In that period, as mentioned, Western civilization was committed to create a society that lives up to the ideas of enlightenment: freedom, equality, and justice for all. The way to achieve that, in modern thinking, was to create an enlightened man, or a civilized man, a man who has transcended his savage origins and rationally organizes his world in the best way. The enlightened man is a universal concept. The belief was that while every one of us has individual traits, rationality is universal, and every human can and should become completely rational and enlightened. It's just that humanity hasn't matured yet, so it still thinks in irrational terms, and the project of enlightenment was to achieve the full maturation of humanity. Once this happens, they believed, once all of us reach our full potential as the ideal enlightened man, we can devise a society that will allow every individual to be happy. So this utopian vision encompassed all humans, regardless of race and gender. We are all on a voyage to get out of the jungle and become a civilized humanity. And yet, when people talked of that man who is advancing towards full enlightenment, it was the white man they were talking of. It was white men who conceived of the idea of the enlightened man, and it was in their image that they conceived him. The white man was tasked with the burden of striving to achieve full maturation and enlightenment, and imparting it to the rest of humanity. So during that period, white men became, in the eyes of Western culture, the center of creation. Looking at it from another perspective, we can say that the goal was to overcome the tribalism of the past and create a society that is cohesive and treats every individual equally. This vision was shared by all Western societies, and the debate revolved around how it is to be achieved. In fascist and communist states, the entire focus was on universal identity, while individualism was suppressed, and the idea was that after we reach the utopian ideal, we can set the individual free again. Democratic societies, on the other hand, try to maintain the balance and the tension between the universal identity and the individual identity, and the belief was that this was the best way forward. In the US, a country built on individualistic values, there was a stronger emphasis on the individual. But one thing they all agreed on was that we should overcome tribalism, and this brings us to the first set of others that we shall discuss. In the beginning of the 20th century, the main others that American society dealt with were the Catholics, mainly those of Irish and Italian origin, and the Jews. Compared to the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who were the all-Americans of the time, the Catholic and Jewish cultures were more communal in nature, and were therefore regarded as tribal. Worse, they were suspected of not being fully loyal to the American society. Catholics were blamed that their ultimate alliance is given to the Pope, whereas Jews were blamed of being loyal only to themselves. The Catholic Americans and Jewish Americans had to develop a culture that was more in tune with individualistic American values and prove their loyalty to America. It took decades, But by the early 1960s, the Catholics and Jews became all-American, whereas American society became more inclusive and realized that it can allow the kind of communality that these groups espoused. Now, that doesn't mean that the problems for Irish, Italians, and Jews were all magically solved. There were still socio-economic problems that remained from the past, but their identity was no longer a problem. They could be proud Irish, Italian, or Jewish Americans and still advance in the American society. Actually, their identity became the coolest thing around in those years, as it was at once both different and acceptable. The epitome of cool in the pop culture of the early 60s was the Rat Pack, an entertainment combo of 5 members who had that outsider identity. Frank Sinatra, the head of the group, was Italian American, as was Dean Martin. Joy Bishop was Jewish American. Peter Lawford was of English origin, but his importance for the pack was that he was related to John F. Kennedy, an Irish American who was the first Catholic American president, and the cool cat himself. And the 5th member of the group was another Jew, Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. wasn't born a Jew. He was an African American who was impressed by the Jewish ability to withstand hardships and felt an affinity to his situation as a black in America. He converted to Judaism in 1961, balancing the number of Jews and Italians in the Rat Pack. This shows us that in the early 60s, being a Jew in America was a pretty cool thing to be. But when we look at the Rat Pack routines, we see that being black was a slightly different matter.
Yeah, want the mics closer?
You want the mics closer?
Closer.
All right. It'll be my guess.
Then we'll just be one.
We don't need this?
Don't need this, huh?
I thought it was separate but equal.
As we can see, Davis was playing along with some rather racist jokes being hurled at him by the other Rat Pack members.
How does it feel to sit in the back of the bus?
They were not actually being racist. They were just not taking the issue very seriously, because the perception at the time was that the race issue in America is about to be solved. The last vestiges of segregation were falling, African Americans were on the way to achieve full equal rights, and the feeling was that just as Italians, Irish, and Jews were accepted into society, so were the blacks. So they felt at ease with making jokes about it.
Oh, I tell you, if we ever get in the lead, you two cats are first. Would you give me no way, baby. Go ahead.
But as the 60s went on, it dawned on America that even though blacks now had equal rights, there was still something holding them back, something preventing their full integration into American society. And that something was the fact that they were still the other. Why was that so? Because, as we recall, the ultimate goal of society was to create a civilized man, a man that will overcome his savage origins. Blacks, in the American mind, were trailing behind in this project, and still had much of the savage in them. With their physicality, sexuality, and rhythmic music, blacks were perceived as people who are still mostly in the jungle, the representative of that part of us that we should leave behind. Therefore, accepting them as they are would have negated the entire ideal American society was driven by. Blacks were expected to adopt the behavior of whites before they could advance in society. Sammy Davis Jr. is an example of an African American who was regarded as civilized and enlightened by America, and could therefore become a respectable entertainer. But for many black folks, the way Sammy Davis Jr. behaved made him an Uncle Tom, someone who sold out his identity and his pride. There was another way, and that was to take the identity that the American culture imposed on them and turn it from negative to positive. In the mid-60s, this approach was embodied in a new musical style called funk. If America was going to regard them as funky, as people who smell bad, then they decided that they would adopt that funk with pride and turn it into a virtue. Funk stripped pop music from any melody, and left only the rhythms, that thing that white culture associated with the savages of the jungle. Here's James Brown, the godfather of funk, singing a funky anthem of black pride in 1968. Those white kids we see around him, trying and failing to clap along with the beat, are trying desperately to look hip, but white ears of the time were incapable of understanding such music. But that's the thing about the human mind. It can learn other ways of thinking, other ways of perceiving the world. In time, and with the help of open-minded white musicians who made funk more accessible to white ears, whites learned to understand and enjoy funk, and blacks, as a result, became less of an other. But that acceptance came only in the late 70s. In the intermediary time, there was tension inside the black community. Those blacks who tried to integrate in society blamed the funk kids that they are adopting the stereotype imposed on them by white culture, whereas the funk kids, in turn, blamed them for being Uncle Toms. Only when the American society at large learned to accept funk could these two sides of black culture come together. By then, of course, there would be another generation of black kids who would regard both of them as Uncle Toms, and come up with a new style that white ears could not comprehend. This is basically the story of African American culture throughout the 20th century. Now, how did this play in politics? Well, we find very similar processes here. There's the side of black politics that in the 60s was led by Martin Luther King, a side which argued that black people can be just as civilized as whites and demanded to regard them as such. And then there's the side represented by Malcolm X, which disagreed with Dr. King's approach and claimed that the definition of civilized man must be changed and include black culture as well. Dr. King's approach was to work within the system and included cooperating with white liberals in order to bring the change, whereas the Malcolm X approach would not cooperate with whites, but rather demanded that they change and come to see things his way. In time, though, black and white liberals found a way to isolate the justified parts in Malcolm X's ideas and wrap them in a more acceptable discourse, helping to open American culture to make it inclusive of those ideas. This, in turn, de-radicalized black politics, and brought more and more blacks to choose Dr. King's way and work within the system. Another minority group that was still an other to the American mind in the 60s was the gays. This is because modern Western culture believed, particularly after Freud, that a healthy sexual development is essential to the development of a civilized man. Therefore, anything that was considered deviant to natural sexuality was regarded as a problem that must be cured. Homosexuality was made legal in the 60s, but this mentality was still predominant, which meant that homosexuals had to hide their orientation if they wanted to advance in society. Or, they could fight to change the situation, and again we find the two approaches. On the one hand, there were those gays who tried to show that they could be good people despite the so-called deviancy, and behaved like straight people. On the other hand, there were those gays who accentuated their difference, and demanded of society to accept them as they are. And again, with help from straight liberals, they gradually managed to change that culture's logic and make themselves less of an other. Then there was the woman. Women were sometimes considered as the other, but mostly they were perceived as the other half. They were part of the voyage towards creating a perfect society, but it was the man who was always considered as the driving force of the progress, and the women as the companion. So women were not excluded, but they did not have as much control over their fate as men had. They were relegated to a secondary role, expected to follow the role assigned to their gender at the time, and for free-thinking women that was an oppressive situation. They too had to fight together to change the prevailing logic, and make it one where women have as much choice as men have. The history of women's struggle is more complicated than black and gay struggles, but we find in it much of the same processes that we've described. These, then, are identity politics. It is a fight to change a situation in which a group is considered an other to the dominant culture, through changing that culture's perception of itself. It needs two sides to succeed. First, there must be a push from people in that ostracized group to redefine themselves in a way that is both authentic to their identity and compatible with Western values, and to demand from society to accept that identity. Second, there must be liberal people in the dominant society who work to change the society's perception of itself and make it inclusive of that group. Identity politics began in earnest in the 1960s, driven mainly by the three groups that we've mentioned: blacks, gays, and women. And over the decades, this struggle managed to change our societies and make them inclusive of those groups, as well as other groups. But something more happened during this struggle. The idea of the enlightened man, that being that travels through history towards achieving its full maturation, had collapsed under the criticism. We've come to realize that this idea that man can be completely rational and devise his world in a totally rational way is a vain and dangerous idea. Actually, hundreds of millions of people were killed, enslaved, and exiled in the name of this idea and in the quest for a perfect society. By the 1980s, the idea of the enlightened man was dead and buried. Instead, we started talking about creating a pluralistic society, where different groups dwell together peacefully. Instead of focusing on universalism and individualism, we've started to focus more on communities. Identity politics scored its first major victory. But there were still problems, even within the liberal camp, because sometimes identity politics were self-contradictory. For instance, as part of the African American struggle to redefine black identity, they had to liberate black men from the degradation of their manhood by the dominant culture, which traditionally referred to the black man as boy. This struggle resulted in the development of a rather macho black male identity which was quite sexist and homophobic, thus clashing with the fight for the rights of women and gays. The proponents of identity politics had to solve these self-contradictions before they could proceed in changing the dominant culture. It wasn't until the early years of the new millennium that it finally felt like liberal culture solved all these inner contradictions, and all the different groups could now work together to rid American society from the remaining notions that were still otherizing blacks, gays, and women. The moment when we first felt liberals had the upper hand came in the 2008 presidential elections, when it suddenly became apparent that being black or a woman no longer stands in your way of being elected President of the United States. And if there was still a nagging doubt that maybe the 2008 elections were just a fluke, came the 2012 elections and put all doubts to rest. It started with the Republican primaries, where even the conservative American Party had a woman and a black as frontrunners for a while. It continued in the general elections, when among the 4 candidates for president and vice president there was not even one who was a WASP. Moreover, any signs of sexism among Republican candidates proved to be extremely harmful to their chances to get elected, whether it was actual offensive remarks.
If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
Or totally benign ones.
So they brought us whole binders full of women.
And it reached its peak on election night, when all gay-related issues on the ballots were won by the liberals, and when America re-elected a black president despite its lukewarm view of his first term. 3 months later came an even more amazing moment, when the conservative, German-born Pope Benedict stepped down and was replaced by the Latino, liberal Pope Francis. It became apparent that even the Catholic Church, the most conservative institution of them all, now had to play by the rules established by identity politics. It was a complete victory, and everything that happened since then only enhanced it. Again, that does not mean that there are no more problems for blacks, gays, or women. But identity is no longer the cause of these problems, at least not on a national level. The American system is now wholly committed to solving these problems, so identity politics have become unnecessary. Regular politics are now enough to fight inequalities. There is no more work for liberals to be done here, beyond working to preserve what's been achieved. But we liberals, of course, are not content with preserving the situation. We want to fight to make things better. We must therefore rethink our tactics, find other causes to fight for, redefine what constitutes a liberal. Not the basic tenets of liberalism, of course, those are fine, but identity politics are no longer useful, and should therefore be discarded and replaced with something else. What are the new causes that we should pick? This is one of the things that I intend to discuss in this channel. In this video, I will just go with the general theme, and ask, who is the other now? What is the group that needs our protection? Well, I can see 2 groups in today's Western society that can be defined as other. The obvious one is the Muslims, and they do indeed suffer discrimination that we should fight against. However, the old rules of identity politics do not apply in this case, because, as we've discussed, for identity politics to work it must have 2 sides. The ostracized group needs to want to become part of the society and define itself in a way that is compatible with its basic ideals, whereas society needs to open itself up and be inclusive of that group. In the case of Muslims, part of their otherness comes from the refusal of a significant part of the community to change their identity and make it compatible with the basic tenets of Western society. They are not just other culturally, they are other to the very idea of a pluralistic society. Those liberals who are still trapped in the logic of identity politics and are trying to apply it to Muslims are therefore driven into a corner where they accept their anti-pluralism as well, thus contradicting the very idea that is at the basis of identity politics. The true liberal approach should be different. It should try to open up Western society to be more inclusive of Muslims in the places where it does not encroach on our ideals, but at the same time it should criticize Islam and demand of Muslims to interpret it in ways that are compatible with Enlightenment values. Identity politics, at the moment, stand in the way of developing such an approach. The other in today's Western society is, surprise surprise, the heterosexual white male. And he became the other due to, that's right, identity politics. Actually, identity politics that have gone out of control. All those years of criticizing a society where straight white males were the dominant force have caused some nitwits to think that the problem is the straight white males themselves, that they are the ones who stand in the way of progress. Rather than seeing the wrongdoings of the past as something that evolved historically, and something that we've all worked together to overcome, these wrongdoings are now blamed on the nature of the straight white male. And so, identity politics are now busy demonizing straight white males and demanding that they change their bad ways or be ostracized. Identity politics, which were once an instrument of tolerance and liberation, are now an instrument of hate and oppression. If you are a true liberal, you must leave them behind.